And greetings, everybody. Welcome to Evidence and Reasons for the Christian Faith. I'm Salvador Cordova. We're going to do just some historical readings on culture and history. As I've been thinking about the content that's going to be on this channel, I'm realizing that I need to have something to do with culture and history, cultural and history. And that was motivated by the fact that some issues regarding culture are splitting the church I attend locally here up in Vienna, McLean, Virginia. So, and I've also had comments from people saying we'd like to explore this topic more. We want to learn more. So I think when there's a need, and if you need it, try to. Now, unlike molecular biophysics or biology, this is not really my specialty. And so I'm going to have to learn some stuff on the fly. Uh, this isn't anything that I've studied academically or professionally. So this is going to be an interesting experience trying to do this. So this will indirectly relate to what I think is kind of the poisoning of God's church and the preaching from the pulpits with leaning ideas, things that are not really gospel, the redefinition of what's justice and what is expected of Christians. So I'm getting a message here that the video and audio are very broken. So Patrick, is that also my talking audio? Let me know if I can take any measures to alleviate that. Thank you for the feedback. I'm going to try to see if I can kill some windows. If it's still broken, I might have to restart. How's the sound now, Patrick? Is it still bad? If you have any feedback, Patrick. Patrick, are you there? I'm looking at my other monitor here, and okay. Seems a little bit better. Okay. Restream doesn't have the best quality, so let me see if I kill my microphone. Okay, Patrick says he'll update in a little bit. So apologies to the audience. This is kind of this is a tough lesson in terms of what platforms to use. I actually like the Restream dashboard, but it does have problems with handling video. So, oh well. Let's see if I can. Okay. All right. So, yeah, this is going to be a funny mode here. I'll be like some channels where people don't even see who the host is, just kind of an icon. And so what I do have to do, however, is share some text. And I can do that. So let's find out a little bit about history of Red China. And And let me do a screen share here. And thank you very much, Patrick. You've been immensely helpful to the channel, and frankly, everyone who's been a regular. So I was looking a little bit about the history of Red China, and the thing we usually hear is that anytime Marxism fails, it's not real Marxism. But let's just look first off. Let's just look first off with at regimes that claim to advocate Marxism. So Marxism has it has inspired ideas like communism and socialism. So let's just look at a communist regime and what has happened. So this was February 5th, 2018. The article, Who Killed More, Hitler, Stalin, or Mao? And let me try to expand the text. In these pages, nearly 7 years ago, Timothy Snyder asked the provocative question, who killed more, Hitler or Stalin? As useful as the exercise in moral rigor was, some think the question itself might have been slightly off. Instead, it should have included a third tyrant of the 20th century, Chairman Mao. And not just that, but that Mao should have been the hands-down winner, with his ledger easily trumping the European dictators. While these questions can devolve into morbid pedantry, they raise moral questions that deserve a fresh look, especially as these months mark the 60th anniversary of the launch of Mao's most infamous experiment in social engineering, the Great Leap Forward. It was this campaign that caused the deaths of tens of millions and catapulted Mao Zedong into the big league of 20th century murderers. So let me comment here. Some of you would normally be seeing me on video, but we're having a little bit of problem with broken audio, and I'm trying to maybe recover that by just using an icon here, so I'm not using my camera. So, yes, now I remember what I wanted to say. I'm disturbed that I'm hearing that public schools are trying to teach kind of a rewritten history of the United States. They're trying to talk about how terrible the United States is and that it's been a very oppressive culture even up until the present day, and just will not say a good thing. It might be instructive to actually teach the history of other countries in detail and compare that then to what's happening in the United States. Because when we start throwing hard numbers and what life is like, I think one will start to value what one has in the United States. And if there's any doubt about the quality of this country, just consider all the people that are supposedly fleeing to this tyrannical country. I mean, if we listen to the left-wing rhetoric coming out of the media and other outlets, one would think this is a place to flee, to flee from and find refuge elsewhere. But we see the actual opposite. And so that right there is telling me that the narrative that is being pushed is not accurate in relative terms. Governor Mario Cuomo of New York famously or infamously said, America was never that great. Just a terrible thing to say. Why is it that we have, in his home state of New York, we have the Statue of Liberty that welcomes immigrants in? It has been known for a while that the United States is a good place to live relative to a lot of places on the planet. So let's continue now. But Mao mistakes, let me just increase the font here, see if I can improve the font. But Mao's mistakes are more than a chance to reflect on the past. They are also now part of a central debate in Xi Jinping's China, where the Communist Party is renewing a long-standing battle to protect its legitimacy by limiting discussions of Mao. The immediate catalyst for the Great Leap Forward took place in late 1957, when Mao visited Moscow for the grand celebration of the 40th anniversary of the October Revolution. Another interesting contrast to recent months, with discussion of its centenary stifled in Moscow and largely ignored in Beijing. The Soviet leader, Nikita Khrushchev, had already annoyed Mao by criticizing Stalin, whom Mao regarded as one of the great figures of communist history. If even Stalin could be purged, Mao could be challenged too. In addition, the Soviet Union had just launched the world's first satellite, Sputnik, which Mao felt overshadowed his accomplishments. He returned to Beijing eager to assert China's position as the world's leading communist nation. This, along with his general impatience, spurred a series of increasingly reckless decisions that led to the worst famine in history. The first sign of Mao's designs came on January 1st, 1958, when the Communist Party's mouthpiece, People's Daily, published an article calling for going all out and aiming higher, code phrases for putting aside patient economic development in favor of radical policies aimed at rapid growth. Mao drove home his plans in a series of meetings over the next months, including a crucial one from January 11th to 20 in the southern Chinese city of Nanning. That changed the Communist Party's culture. Until that moment, Mao had been first among equals, but moderates had often been able to rein him in. Then, in several extraordinary outbursts, he accused any leader who opposed rash advance of being counter-revolutionary. As became the pattern of his reign, no one successfully stood up to him. Having silenced party opposition, Mao pushed for the creation of communes, effectively nationalizing farmers' property. People were to eat in canteens and share agricultural equipment, livestock, and production. Local party leaders were ordered to obey fanciful ideas for increasing crop yields, such as planting crops closer together. The idea was to create China's own Sputnik, harvests astronomically greater than any in human history. This might have resulted in no more harm than local officials falsifying statistics to meet quotas, except that the state relied on these numbers to calculate taxes on farmers. To meet their taxes, farmers were forced to send any grain they had to the state as if they were producing these insanely high yields. Ominously, officials also confiscated seed grain to meet their targets. So while storehouses bulged with grain, farmers had nothing to eat and nothing to plant the next spring. So let me try to interpret what this means, is they had to give the appearance that they had so much grain they needed to build all these storehouses and fill it while the farmers and the populace were starving. So I'll just read that again. To meet their taxes, farmers were forced to send any grain they had to the state as if they were producing these insanely high yields. Ominously, officials also confiscated seed grain, that is, grain needed to plant uh, the next cycle of crops. Officials also confiscated seed grain to meet their targets. So while storehouses bulged with grain, farmers had nothing to eat and nothing to plant the next spring. Compounding this crisis were equally diluted plans to bolster steel production through the creation of backyard furnaces, small coal or wood fired kilns that were somehow supposed to create steel out of iron ore. Unable to produce real steel, local party officials ordered farmers to melt down their agricultural implements to satisfy Mao's national targets. The result was that the farmers had no grain, no seed, and no tools. Famine set in. Before I make more commentary on this, this is just alarming. Why is this not taught in school as a lesson? I learned a lot just reading things like this, and just like, one when one hears the rhetoric coming out of the left, how terrible the United States is, it's like, well, I don't, my intuition says they're wrong, but I need something more tangible. All one has to do is read stuff like this, and you'll see the United States, people that have lived in the United States a long time, and I've lived in the United States since 1966. I can tell you, thank God, I've never gone through anything like what's being described here. When in 1959 Mao was challenged about these events at a party conference, he purged his enemies. Enveloped by an atmosphere of terror, officials returned to China's provinces to double down on Mao's policies. Tens of millions died. No independent historian doubts that tens of millions died during the Great Leap Forward, but the exact numbers and how one reconciles them have remained matters of debate. The overall trend, though, has been to raise the figure, despite pushback from the Communist Party revisionists and a few Western sympathizers. Oh yeah, left-wing academia in the West. On the Chinese side, this involves a cottage industry of Mao apologists, willing to do whatever it takes to keep the Mao name sacred. Historians working at Chinese institutions who argue that the numbers have been inflated by bad statistical work. Their most prominent spokesman is Sun Jingjian, a mathematician at Shandong University in Jiangsu Normal University. He attributes changes in China's population during this period as due to faulty statistics, changes in how households were registered, and a series of other obfuscatory factors. His conclusion: famine killed only 3.66 million people. This contradicts almost every other serious effort at accounting for the effects of Mao's changes. Oh, there's a picture there. A wall showing the damage caused by an earthquake that occurred May 12, 2008 in Sichuan province is decorated with portraits of former Chinese leader Mao Zedong in Baichan City, Sichuan province, May 31st, 2008. More than 68,000 people died in the quake and around 4.8 million were left homeless. So rather than repair the wall, put pictures of Mao Zedong. The first reliable scholarly estimates derived from the pioneering work of the demographer Judith Bannister, who died in 1987, used Chinese demographic statistics to come up with a remarkable, durable estimate of 30 million. And the journalist Jasper Becker, who in his 1966 work, Hungry Ghosts, gave these numbers a human dimension and offered a clear historical analysis of the events. At the most basic level, the early works took the net decline in China's population during this period and added to that the decline in birth rate, a classic effect of famine. Later scholars refined this methodology by looking at local histories compiled by government offices that gave very detailed accounts of famine conditions. Triangulating these two sources of information resulted in estimates that start in the mid 20 millions and go up to 45 million. Two more recent accounts give what are widely regarded as the most credible numbers. One in 2008 is by the Chinese journalist Yang Jisheng, who estimates that 35 million died. Hong Kong University's Frank Decoter has a higher but equally plausible estimate of 45 million. Besides adjusting the numbers upward, Decoter and others have made another important point. Many deaths were violent. Communist Party officials beat to death anyone suspected of hoarding grain, or people who tried to escape the death farms by traveling to cities. And this is the NYRB China archive. There's a picture there of Mao Zedong. The worst man-made catastrophe ever. Roderick McFarquhar from the New York Review of Books. Yeah, look at that happy picture. How's that for fake news? Oh my goodness. So let's just continue. Honestly, guys, I've studied this a little bit, and I've just been so distracted with other things, like, good things like molecular biology, molecular biophysics, that I haven't looked into this. But because of events in my local church, I'm looking a little bit more into communism and Marxism and why it's bad for Christianity. So um, I'm just going to pause a little bit here. Patrick Alexander said that there was some problem with the audio. How's it coming across, guys? If you could give me a little feedback. I hope that what I did improved by cutting off my video. I hope that helped. Regardless of how one views these revisions, the Great Leap famine was by far the largest famine in history. It was also man-made, and not because of war or disease, but by government policies that were flawed and recognized as such at the time by reasonable people in the Chinese government. Now, thanks, Nicholas. Thanks, Patrick. Thanks again, Patrick, for the feedback. So I'm going to just point out here, this is why free speech is valuable. It prevents tyrants from killing people that disagree with them. This is what happens when a leader can rise to power and he can't be called out on what he's doing wrong. This is why free speech is important. Going back to the biblical model, and then what's happening recently in my local church. In the biblical model, when there are concerns about someone's behavior or conduct, you bring it before the congregation. It has to be aired publicly, and it can be discussed, and leadership can be voted out. We have to add some protocols that we call like church constitution. But in the United States, Dr. Sandy Pigeon told me that the model for the constitutions of the colonies, the states, before the Declaration of Independence came from the church constitution models, the models of church constitutions. And then we ended up having the United States Constitution. This model of freedom and free speech, the freedom of assembly, and the freedom to speak one's conscience is very important. This absurd situation where someone in Mao Zedong is trying to save face. It's so important that he wants to say he's going to kill people that point out he messed up. He'd rather let millions of people starve than to lose face. This is just terrible. This is why free speech is important. This is an example of what happens when you can't tell the truth. Can all this be blamed on Mao? Traditionally, Mao apologists blame any deaths that did occur on natural disasters. Goodness, even now. Even today, this era is known in China as the period of 3 years of natural disasters, or the 3 years of difficulty. See, this is revisionist history. So obvious where the fault lies. We can discard natural causes. Yes, there were some problems with drought and flooding, but China is a huge country regularly beset by droughts and floods. Chinese governments through the centuries have been adept at famine relief. A normal government, especially a modern bureaucratic state with a vast army and unified political party at its disposal, should have been able to handle the floods and droughts excuse me, that farmers encountered at the end of the 1950s. What of the explanation that Mao meant well, but that his policies were misguided or carried out too zealously by subordinates? But Mao knew early enough that his policies were resulting in famine. He could have changed course, but he stubbornly stuck to his guns in order to retain power. In addition, his purging of senior leaders set the tone at the grassroots level. If he had pursued a less radical policy and listened to advice and encouraged his underlings to do so as well, their actions would surely have been different. But Mao's policies were responsible for other deaths on top of those caused by the famine. The Cultural Revolution, the 10-year period, 1966 to 1976, of government-instigated chaos and violence against imagined enemies resulted in probably 2 to 3 million deaths, according to historians such as Song Yong-yi of California State University, Los Angeles, who compiled extensive databases on these sensitive periods of history. I called to ask for his estimates, and he said he would add another 1 to 2 million for other campaigns, such as land reform and anti-rightist movements in the 1950s. The University of Freiburg's Daniel Leese gave me similar figures. He estimates 32 million in the Great Leap Forward, 1 to 1.6 million for the Cultural Revolution, and another million for the other campaigns. It is probably fair to say then that Mao was responsible for about 1.5 million deaths during the Cultural Revolution, another million for the other campaigns, and between 35 million and 45 million for the Great Leap Famine. Taking a middle number for the famine, 40 million, and that's about 42.5 million deaths. And there is another archive. China, the worse than you ever imagined. At this point, I must digress briefly to deal with two specters that diligent researchers will find on the internet and even on the shelves of otherwise reputable bookstores. Scientist Rudolf Rummel, 1932 to 2014, a non-Chinese specialist who made widely higher estimates than any other historian that Mao was responsible for 77 million deaths. His work is disregarded as polemical, but has a strange life online where it is cited regularly by anyone who wants to score a quick victory for Mao. Equally scorned but extremely influential is the British-based author Zheng Chang. After writing a best-selling memoir about her family, the most popular in what now seems like an endless succession of imitators, she moved on to write, along with her husband, John Halliday, popular history, including a biography of Mao as a monster. Few historians take their work seriously, and several of the most influential figures in the field, including Andrew J. Nathan, Timothy Cheek, Jonathan Spence, um, Jeremy Barmay, Gao Mobo, and David S. G. Goodman, published a book to rebut it. No matter, a dozen years after publication, Chang's work is still on bookshelves around the Western world, while the Amazon blurb misleadingly calls it the most authoritative life of the Chinese leader ever written. According to Chang, Mao was responsible for 70 million deaths in peacetime, more than any other 20th century leader. The peacetime adjective is significant because it gets Hitler out of the picture, but is starting a war of aggression of less but is starting a war of aggression less of a crime than launching economic policies that cause famine. How finally does Mao's record compare to those of Hitler and Stalin? Snyder estimates that Hitler was responsible for between 11 and 12 million non-combatant deaths, while Stalin was responsible for at least 6 million and as many as 9 million if foreseeable deaths caused by deportation, starvation, and incarceration in concentration camps are included. Hitler and Stalin numbers invite questions that Mao's higher ones do not. Should we let Hitler, especially, off the hook for combatant deaths in World War II? It is probably fair to say that without Hitler, there wouldn't have been a European war. If one includes the combatant deaths, and these deaths due to war-related famine and disease, the numbers shoot up astronomically. The Soviet Union suffered upward of 8 million combatant deaths, and many more due to famine and disease, perhaps about 20 million. Then again, wasn't Stalin partly responsible for these deaths because he purged his best generals and adopted reckless military policies? As for Hitler, his deaths, the hundreds of thousands who died in the aerial bombardment of German cities. Should his death include the hundreds of thousands who died in the aerial bombardments of German cities? After all, it was his decision to strip German cities of anti-aircraft batteries to replace lost artillery following the debacle at Stalingrad. Also, there's a book called Tombstone, and The Great Chinese Famine, 1958 to 1962, Yang Zhisheng. An estimated 36 million Chinese men and women, children starved to death during China's Great Leap Forward in the late 1950s and early 60s. One of the greatest tragedies of the 20th century, the famine is poorly understood and in China is still euphemistically referred to as, and I'm sorry that it scrolled off. Yeah, I don't know what happened. Let me see if I reduce. Euphemistically referred to as, uh, that didn't help. Sorry, guys. It's just not rendering nicely on my browser. I think it's like the 3 years of difficulty. So let me just briefly look at the. Let me briefly look at the chat, see what's going on, and then we'll resume. I'm just doing a. I'm just going to pause for a little commercial break. Next Legal, thank you very much for. Um, hang on. Thank you very much for the kind words. You too, Nicholas and Mr. Jetty. I didn't know that. Thank you, Mr. Jetty. Oh, goodness. Okay, so let's continue. Thank you, thank you all for the comments. And what of the millions of Germans in the East who died after being ethnically cleansed and driven by the Red Army from their homes? On whose ledger do they belong? These considerations add to Stalin's total, but they still more increase Hitler's. Slowly, Hitler's numbers approach Mao's. And there is the sensitive matter of percentages. Mao's numbers are high because of the famine, without which he wouldn't be in the running for Butcher of the Century. I'm sorry, this is kind of black humor. Sorry. Um, um, and there is the sensitive matter of percentages. Mao's numbers are high because of the famine, without which he wouldn't be in the running for Butcher of the Century. But if Mao had been the leader of Thailand, he wouldn't be in the running. It was because his policies played out in China, with the world's largest population, that they resulted in such high absolute numbers of deaths. So is Mao simply a reflection of the fact that anything that happens in China becomes a superlative, and that by definition the world's Pol Pots can never compete? Relativizing can be perilous. As Snyder writes, the difference between 0 and 1 is an infinity, thinking perhaps of the dictum often attributed to Stalin that a single death is a tragedy, a million deaths is a statistic. Okay, I'm sorry to laugh. It is true that we can grasp when a loved one dies, but have a harder time accepting when the difference is between a million and one deaths. But the correct answer, of course, is that even one extra death tilts the scales. Death is an absolute. Yet all these numbers are little more than well informed guesstimates. There are no records that will magically resolve the question of exactly how many died in the Mao era. We can only extrapolate based on flawed sources. If the percentage of deaths attributable to the famine is slightly changed, that's the difference between 30 and 45 million deaths. So in these sorts of discussions, the difference is not infinity, but a rounding error. Mao didn't order people to their deaths in the same way Hitler did, so it's fair to say that Mao's famine deaths were not genocide, in contrast, arguably, to Stalin's Holodomor in the Ukraine, the terror famine described by journalist and historian Anne Applebaum in Red Famine 2017. Just let me time out here. Uh, I, I did not know about this, guys. I did not know about this red famine and all these other things. Why? Because maybe I spent too much time following the news and all the bad things happening in America. But if we follow what had happened in history in these other countries, maybe the population of the United States wouldn't be so left wing and thinking socialism's a good thing. One can argue that by closing down discussion in 1959, yes, closing down discussion, Mao sealed the fate of tens of millions. But almost every legal system in the world recognizes the difference between murder in the first degree and manslaughter and negligence. Shouldn't the same standards apply to dictators? When Khrushchev took Stalin off his pedestal, the Soviet state still had Lenin as its idealized founding father. That allowed Khrushchev to purge the dictator without delegitimizing the Soviet state. By contrast, Mao himself and his successors have always realized that he was both China's Lenin and its Stalin. Thus, after Mao died, the Communist Party settled on a formula of declaring that Mao had made mistakes. About 30% of what he did was declared wrong, and 70% was right. That's essentially the formula used today. Mao's mistakes were set down and commissions set out to explore the worst of his crimes, but his picture remains in Tiananmen Square. So this article is saying that there is reason to preserve his memory in order to legitimize the current leadership, Communist China. Xi Jinping has held fast to this view of Mao in recent years. In Xi's way of looking at China, the country had roughly 30 years of Maoism and 30 years of Deng Xiaoping's economic liberalization and rapid growth. Xi has warned that neither era can negate the other. They are inseparable. How to deal with Mao? Many Chinese, especially those who lived through his rule, do so by publishing underground journals or documentary films. Perhaps typically for a modern consumer society, though. Mao and his memory have also been turned into kitschy products. The first commune, the Sputnik commune that launched the Great Leap Forward, is now a retreat for city folk who want to experience the joys of rural life. 1 in 10 villagers there died of famine, and people were dragged off and flayed for trying to hide grain from government officials. Today, urbanites go there to decompress from the stresses of modern life. This is terrible. They did. China's Brave Underground Journal, too. Foreigners aren't exempt from this sort of historical amnesia either. One of Beijing's most popular breweries is the Great Leap Brewery, which features a Mao era symbol of a fist clenching a beer stein instead of the clods of grass and earth that farmers tried to eat during the famine, perhaps because of the revolting idea of a brew pub being named after a famine. Goodness. The company began in 2015 to explain on its website that the name came not from Maoist history, but an obscure song, dynasty song. Only when you're young and fat, goes the verse, does one dare risk a great leap. I'm going to risk putting myself back on the camera briefly. Tell me if it's negatively affecting the audio quality, and um, if so, I'm going to go back to just the icon. I will point out something. Mr. Jetty says 61 million abortions and counting in the USA alone. So I never really I want to acknowledge that, because I guess the distinction here is that life for those who are alive and who weren't aborted is good in the United States. It's terrible for the unborn. So that is a very valid point, that there have been atrocities here in the United States as well. And I don't know what the abortion numbers are in other countries. And so I'm just going to acknowledge your point, Mr. Jetty, that um, there have been terrible things in the United States. Um, but I can't attribute it to, like, say, the Constitution of the United States, um, and the philosophy of the founding fathers, and the Christian kind of the Christian moral fabric that it'd been a theme throughout most of America's history. There was a Christian moral fabric. I know that when I arrived in the United States, even in the 70s, there was debate about the Sunday blue laws. Businesses still closed in honor of the Lord's Day here in nearby liberal Maryland. There were still, one can't escape the 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 Christian threat and the idea of free markets and free speech in the United States. But still, sadly, as Mr. Getty points out, 61 million abortions and counting in the USA alone. So in the 70s also was the landmark Supreme Court decision, Roe versus Wade, and that liberalized and made abortion legal. In that parallel, a meltdown in American culture. So thank you for pointing that out. Guys in the chat, some great brains there and great insights. Before I forget, I mentioned this in other streams. My sisters were nearly aborted. Mom and she had complications that affected her physically. She couldn't keep food down, just would vomit whenever she was pregnant. And the doctor said, well, just abort the kids. And mom and dad refused. My sisters were born. So the topic of abortion is close to home. And I want to commend my mother and father's courage. Mom said she'd rather die than to abort her kids. She would risk her life for, like a lot of mothers would, for the children she loved. So my sisters were born, and they went on to be nurses and served in the medical profession. The third pregnancy was me, and she got a better doctor that gave her IVs every day or something like that. I don't know the exact story, but that pregnancy was easier. So how's the audio coming through, guys? Did Restream recover? I'm going to go back to the icon in the meantime, and let me look for some more articles. I'm going to just throw, let's see, we've been going for 49 minutes. Okay, great. The audio is good. Thanks, Doki, and greetings, Doki. Oh, long time no see, Doki Doki Bible Club. I've seen other Dokis, but that's the original Doki. Okay, so I didn't know that this reading was going to be so long. So let me just say here, I'm going to go into some territory I'm not really familiar with. So why is it that communist states, okay, so let's say that they were the best of intentions. Why is it that Marxist states seem to just attract tyrants? And I mean, this is something that I think it's a question that needs to be raised, and I haven't been able to analyze this. But the first thing that I saw, at least in the case of Mao, is that there was lack of free flow of information and speech. There is great risk when power is centralized like that you can attract a tyrant. What ends up happening is, if the state owns everything, who's going to police the people running the state? Who are they accountable to? There's a problem of accountability. A state that's powerful enough to confiscate property, who are they going to be who are they accountable to? Who's going to stop a tyrant that now basically owns. Okay, so you have the state that confiscates property, and the state is, the government is run by leaders. Who are they accountable to? There's okay, so there are two things I see. The centralization of power is very bad in that sense when there's no accountability. Second, Marx was an atheist, wanted to eliminate religion, especially the Christian religion. Peter Hitchens pointed out that is Christopher Hitchens, the atheist's younger brother, is Peter Hitchens. Peter Hitchens was a communist, what he called a Trotskyite, something like that. There's a difference between the Bolsheviks and Trotsky or something like that. But suffice to say, he realized if the moral code is dictated by the communist leaders, history has shown this doesn't end well. Whereas if you have a moral code, someone said he hears birds. Okay, let me try to shut down. If the moral code descends from the Christian God, it's not at the whims of tyrants. What was happening with the tyrannical leader in Mao Zedong, neither he nor his underlings had any moral fabric to resist what was going on. Communism doesn't thrive well in an environment where there is a sense of morality, because then the means toward an end, the process, there's an ethical process. The goal is not to create a communist state by any means. The goal is to, under a moral cultural framework that Christianity gives, the goal is to serve God and act ethically and morally. The other thing is, in the New Testament even, it says, don't steal. Don't steal. There's an idea that there is the idea that people have property. You don't commit theft. So yes, there was the situation in Acts where people sold their property and shared it among one another. That's voluntary. Praise God for that. But in the Old and New Testament, there's a sense you don't steal. That means that there has to be a rightful process to transfer property from one individual to another. The state can't just go in there and say, oh, you don't deserve this, it belongs to the people. And interestingly, the American Revolution, I hear, and this is an interesting historical discussion, the British said that the American Revolution was driven by the Black Robe regiments, referring to the preachers. Very interesting. The preachers were viewing kind of the interference of the government as theft. The government had to be limited in the way that it could access people's property. Oh, this is a good one, Ray. I used to have a bumper sticker that said, don't steal, the government hates competition. And Nicholas, the Hitchens I was referring to is Peter Hitchens, the younger brother of the Christopher Hitchens you were talking about. So Peter Hitchens. So the two brothers, one was the notorious atheist and the other was the repentant atheist who became a Christian. That's Peter Hitchens. And communism is the opiate of intellectuals. Thank you. So let me now. I'm going to look for another article, maybe to close off this stream, and we'll examine this. I'll probably revisit the article I'm about to read. Of all people, it's Albert Mohler, who's with the Southern Baptist Convention, who is accused, and I think probably rightly so, for allowing a lot of kind of this cultural Marxism to invade the Southern Baptist Convention. And this is really disappointing because he actually had some good interviews that were pro-free markets and pro-free speech. So it's really disappointing to see the turnabout that he's done in recent years. So this, what I'm about to say, is not an endorsement of Albert Mohler's current damage being done, in my opinion, to the Southern Baptist Convention. And let me just yeah. So that being said, and thank you for the comment, Nicholas. That being said, I'm going to share something maybe when he was in his good self before he went to the dark side. And that'll do it for tonight's stream. Yes. Okay, yeah, sorry. Thanks for giving me a chance also to clarify which Hitchens I was talking about. Yes, yes, Peter and Christopher Hitchens were atheists and communists. One got saved and found Christ. So Albert Mohler interviewed this gentleman, Paul Kegnor. And so this is, I don't have Paul Kengor's books. And so this is February 10th, 2021. Give me a moment. I have to turn off the electric fan. I'm getting cold. 1 second. Actually, I need to take a quick break. I need to shut down kind of the air conditioning in the house. It's getting really cold here. I'll be right back. All right, guys. Thank you for your forbearance. We have a lot of, I have several air conditioning units in the house. I had to run around the house to shut them down. I let the house get a little too hot today. Anyway, let's resume. So, Karl Marx meets the devil, a con with historian Paul Kegnor. And it's almost worth reading this twice. So, unfortunately, I'll have to do the part of Albert Mohler and Paul Kegnor in this interview. I was hoping Emery would be here. Oh, there is a video. I just noticed that. I don't have to do a reading, but I'll anyway, because then I can do commentary. So I think I'll put this in the video description so you all can read it. This is so Albert Mohler. This is Thinking in Public, a program dedicated to intelligent conversation about frontline theological and cultural issues with people who are shaping them. I'm Al Mohler, your host and president of the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary in Louisville, Kentucky. Paul Kegnor is professor of political science, and he's also senior director of the for Faith and Freedom at Grove City College in Pennsylvania. He earned his master's degree from the American University, his PhD from the University of Pittsburgh. He's a renowned scholar of the Cold War and communism and the American presidency. His book, God and Ronald Reagan, was a New York Times bestseller. He's written many other books, and we've had a previous conversation for Thinking in Public. His most recent book is The Devil and Karl Marx, Communism's Long March of Death, Deception and Infiltration, which is the topic of our conversation today. Professor Kegnor, welcome to Thinking in Public. Kegnor. Dr. Mohler, it's great to be with you. I think we did an interview a few years ago about my books, and I'm a big fan. I love your show and always enjoy these conversations. Thank you. Mohler. Well, thank you, Paul. I've really been looking forward to this conversation. I have to tell you that when I saw the title of your latest book, The Devil and Karl Marx, I was, of course, doubly interested. And looking at your book, I was actually amazed by how considerable in size it is and dense with material, because even as someone who's studied Marx as part of a larger study of the intellectual landscape for 4 decades, or more frankly, I was surprised how much material there is just dealing directly with Karl Marx and the devil. Mohler. Now, at this point in your research and academic work, did this come as something of a surprise to you, Kegnor? I'd say a little bit. I knew a pretty good deal about it already, and I had been thinking for years about writing a book on this. And I'm sure that you, Al, you probably are familiar with Reverend Richard Wurmbrand, the founder of the Voice of the Martyrs. He did the book Tortured for Christ in the 1970s. He also did a book called Marx and Satan, and that was, I think, mid-80s. And I have it marked up. Also, I read Paul Johnson's Intellectuals, which had a chapter on Karl Marx. And the one book that I wasn't really familiar with, I'd seen it referenced by Johnson, but it was the first time I had dug into it, was Robert Paine, who was a biographer of Marx, an impressive British intellectual, kind of a thoughtful man of the arts, of letters, a theater critic, drama, English, very learned individual, in no way any kind of ideologue. And he did a number of biographies of Marx. He did one in 1968 that was published by Simon & Schuster. He did another that was published by New York University Press. and he's really the guy who found a lot of this. Marx's writings about the devil were first discovered by his original biographer, a guy named Franz Mehring, and I know you probably want to get to this, so I might be talking a little bit out of order. But when Franz Mehring discovered these writings, he told Marx's daughter, he said, quote, "You should not let this stuff see the light of day. This is bad. This is really quite frightening stuff," end quote. So I knew about those things, but once I started digging into a bunch of Marx biographies with specific intent. You know how this goes, doing research on something like this, where you really start mining and looking for the material. I did a book, God and Ronald Reagan, back in 2004. I think I had read every biography of Reagan, and so I knew some of the religious stuff, but not until I went back to Edmund Morris Dutch, until I went to Lou Cannon's biographies and looked for every religious reference, went back and read all the letters, went to the Reagan Library. Then you line it all up and you've got this giant puzzle thrown out on the floor, and you start lining up the puzzles and you say, wow, there's a lot here. Mohler, no. Kegnor, there's really a lot here. So yeah, that's, well, Mohler, one question, go ahead. Uh, that as a historian and historical theologian, I try to employ is asking whether a question is anachronistic and out of its time. And so there's a sense in which we might say that the question of something like an obsession of the devil on the part of Karl Marx, that if it's all of a sudden discovered now and considered troubling now by Professor Paul Kegnor of Grove City College, well, that's not an insignificant issue. But if it turned out to have been significant to people at the time, that adds historical cogency and importance. And that's one of the reasons why I appreciate you mentioning Mehring, because he very clearly identified the problem dealing with the primary source material. And as you say, was so alarmed by it, he did everything he could to prevent publication. Kegnor. Well, and kudos to a Marxist scholar at the Marx Engels Institute named David Ryazanov, who discovered this material and preserved it, made sure it was known. And kudos here to all recent Marx biographers, hagiographers, who, Dr. Mohler, they ignore all of this stuff. They ignore all of it. And they certainly ignore the poetry. And if they do come across certain things that I included in the book, to be fair, some of these things are reported by Marx biographers, Francis Wien and a few others, but they'll downplay it and they'll almost give it a kind of wink, wink. They'll think it's playful or endearing. They use words like that, or cute. It's strange. It's, oh, here it is, and his friend describes him as eyes wet like a goblin. Look at this nice little horseplay between Marx and this individual. Horseplay? Look at it. The guy's describing Marx as if he's possessed here. Mohler. So let's talk about it. Gengor. Yeah. Mohler. Let's actually bring our audience in on the core issue. And that is, your argument is that Karl Marx had an obsession with Satan. And clearly, even as he sought in every way possible to kill off God and even organize religion, he had an enormous sympathy for the devil, and clearly, in some sense, believed in the devil. Now, we're going to talk about what that may have meant, but he clearly believed in the personification of evil. Kegnor, yeah. And some of those poems, for example, and I will say this, it's often hard to know if what he's writing about, like any writer or poet, he's internalizing, he's projecting. It's what he believes. But when you see the whole composite, this isn't like Edgar Allan Poe writing a scary story. You can see in Marx's case, it's very reflective of what he believes. And I opened the book with a couple of stanzas from a couple different poems. And one from The Player, Marx says, "Thus heaven I forfeited, I know it full well. My soul, once true to God, is chosen for hell. Let me repeat that. Marx says, thus heaven I forfeited. I know it full well. My soul once hell. And I think that one, Al, is pretty, and I think that one, Al, is pretty autobiographical. Because his soul was once true to God, and heaven he did forfeit. Now, I don't know if it was chosen for hell. I think he made the choice that he made. He made the choice to reject God. And then there was a second one that I open with, and he talks about it. He says, see this sword, this blood dark sword which stabs unerringly within my soul. Where did I get the sword? The Prince of Darkness. The Prince of Darkness sold it to me. The hellish vapors rise and fill the brain until my heart goes mad, until I utterly go insane. Let me read it again. He says, see this sword, this blood dark sword, which stabs unerringly within my soul. Where did I get this sword? The Prince of Darkness. The Prince of Darkness sold it to me. The hellish vapors rise and fill the brain until my heart goes mad, until I utterly go insane. So really some chilling poetry. And also, too, these poems and his plays, they're filled with destruction, death, suicide pacts. And of all things, you're a historian. Can you name for me any individual that you could think of in all history who had two daughters who killed themselves in suicide pacts with their husbands? Of all things. And Marx writes about fair maidens, pale maidens, suicide pacts. Marx had two daughters who killed themselves with suicide pacts with their husbands, one of which Marx was cruel to, Paul Lafargue, because he was partly Cuban and Marx was an out and out vile racist, and he referred to Paul as the gorilla. And there are letters between him and Engels going back and forth. Are you using the term in the context of their own writings? Kegnor. Yeah, these guys were atheistic materialists, Darwinian evolutionists. And here we get back to another one of those sort of skeletons in the progressive closet, along with eugenics and so forth. And when they forsake God, Darwin, in fact, I quote in the book Trotsky, who said, Darwin did away with all my ideological prejudices. He opened the universe to me, end quote. Let me read that again. Darwin did away with all of my ideological prejudices. He opened the universe to me, end quote. And it was at Marx's funeral where Engels gave the eulogy. Marx is doing for Darwinians in social sciences what Darwin did for the physical sciences. And he also, Engels at the funeral of Marx's wife, quoted Darwin as well. So they were proud Darwinian evolutionists. So let me pause here. Okay, I want to acknowledge Nicholas here. Thank you for the critical thinking. It is true that the two daughters committed suicide. The details that Kegnor gave were slightly off, and Nicholas called it out. One daughter was married. You can look at Wikipedia, and the other, I don't know, didn't die with her husband, as far as I know. So thank you, Nicholas. So I appreciate there's some impressive scholarship there, Nicholas. So let me just look at this. All right, so let me share some of the side chat. Okay, Nicholas, we should have a discussion. If you've done research on this, I would would you be interested in having a discussion with me sometime? We're at 1 hour 16, and I'm going to try not to make this such a brutally long discussion. So maybe we'll go on for maybe 20 minutes, hopefully at most, and we'll just pursue it later. So I don't wear myself out and the audience out with my usual long monologues. So I'm going to just go through here. Yes, both of Marx's daughters committed suicide. So I Googled this, and it was troubling. And they were lovely ladies too. Just unimaginable that they would end up that way. So I believe that's Lennon. Lennon is John Lennon of the Beatles. So because Marx's poetry specifically prophesied the damage his ideologies would do, and did so years before Marx even began to write his dogmas, it's not right for anyone to downplay the facts. And so Marx switched from writing spiritual poetry devoted to Satan and moved to writing Satan's dogmas as political manifesto. Interesting. Now I'm going to quote something. I'm not going to do the whole Mohler Kegnor dialogue because I think I've given the juicy stuff, but I'm going to share something. Let me see if I can find this. All right. So in the meantime, let me just keep scrolling through the comment section. Yeah, pretty creepy. Pretty creepy. And I'm having a little problem with the scroll bar, so I'm missing some great comments. So what did... Oh, Marx being satanic is the least surprising thing I ever heard. And Jesus here says, according to Vodi Bakum, the CRT is based off Gramscian Marxism. Yes. And this Gramscian Marxism is invading McLean Bible Church. And I want to point out kind of the current conflict at my local church, which sparked my interest in this topic. The way it's being handled is the free congregational meetings where people should be, on biblical grounds, given the right to raise their concerns. They're being silenced. Concerns are being silenced. Dissenting voices are not being welcomed. They're being demonized. They're being deplatformed. Exactly, not very wholesome ways of conduct. Using the same tactics play out. And so this is kind of a larger issue with our society. The component in the United States now is it's not just the government. It is private interests that are party to this deplatforming and suppression of important facts that should be highlighted, and then simultaneously the propagation of fake news. So I really want to thank Nicholas here. He called out a mistake by Kegnor. So it is an interesting project then. If we can to the extent we can independently confirm Kegnor's claims, because if so, like these poems, if they're available, this is really shocking. The world needs to know this. A show on Karl Marx would be great. A show on the Marx brothers would be great too. Okay. And I may skip some of the messages here. So the autobiography of Miley Cyrus. Um, and let me highlight this by Patrick Alexander. You know what is sad about the human race? We don't learn from our mistakes until it's too late. Thus, we repeat the same mistakes over and over. No wonder we need Jesus Christ. Oh, so Nicholas, could we do a show on this? I'll email you. You seem to be a scholar on this, and this would be helpful. It's nice not to have just a single source, because then you worry that it's propaganda. It's great if we can go to the original sources and close to the original sayings. Now, as Ray said, none of this is surprising. So I'm going to look into this more, but let me close with some other parts of this interview. So Kegnor, this is farther down in the interview here. And Bakunin does this in a way that Saul Alinsky does well. Saul Alinsky dedicates Rules to Radicals to that first rebel who rebelled against God and won for himself his own kingdom, Lucifer. So Saul Alinsky, who was Hillary Clinton's teacher, I'll just quote, that first, Saul Alinsky dedicates Rules to Radicals to, quote, that first rebel who rebelled against God and won for himself his own kingdom, Lucifer, end quote. And he refers to him. So they like Satan as this rebellious character who shakes his fist at God. And that's what Marx did too. You see this in Marx's plays, in his poems. Marx wanted to burn down the house. Marx and his characters in the end of these plays, they are standing there in the pit of these embers, flames all around them. Oh, gee, does that remind us of like the Antifa and Black Lives Matter protest, flames all around? Marx had a favorite line all of his biographers said from Goethe's Faust. The Mephistopheles character, the devil character, the demon character said, everything that exists deserves to perish. Everything that exists deserves to perish. Everything that exists deserves to perish. End quote. Imagine that. If they asked you or I, do you have a favorite line? We'd give a scripture verse. I might say something like, be not afraid. Something like that. Marx said, oh yeah, Goethe, Faust, Mephistopheles, everything that exists deserves to perish. That was Marx's favorite. Peter Hitchens' book was The Rage Against God. Atheists have had this, the anti-theists. So we have a variety of atheists, and I did a show on this. One psychologist did like 6 psychological categories, typologies. The anti-theists, the ones that are particularly militant against Christianity, there's a lot of rage there. And Peter Hitchens' books was The Rage Against God, How Atheism Led Me to Faith. He definitely saw this tendency to rage. And so we see in the demonstrations all this that happened in 2020, all this rage, the burning down of cities and communities, this thing that Marx said, quoting Mephistopheles, everything that exists deserves to perish. That's just flat out hatred of reality. And Jordan Peterson also, he saw this in mass murderers. They just the hatred of everything, and it just explodes. And I gotta just say, this is kind of disturbing, a disturbing title. At McLean Bible Church, Pastor David Platt, his best-selling book is Radical. And just like, could you have chosen a better title? It's a terrible title, given that we have stuff like Alinsky. Why are you naming a Christian book Radical? So, and I think that book was also a criticism of the American dream. And I've never read it, but it's like, it just, it's just a terrible title for a book. So Ray here says, I couldn't finish Rules for Radicals. Paired of pointless anecdotes and sophist history. All it said, as far as I could see, was the ends justify the means, so long as the means don't hurt your cause. In his images here, Emery is a busy guy. He's finishing. I thought he was done with exams in grad school, so I was asking him to come up on my shows. I didn't realize he was still in the middle of grad school. So I'm really grateful now, Emery, that you had joined me in some of my streams. So I was actually doing a really good interview that Al Mohler conducted with Paul Kegnor, just to update Emery. And it had to do with Karl Marx's Satanism. Even though he's an atheist, I now understand it a little better, because we have, like, having me debated Amy Newman and Raging Atheist on Modern Day Debate, where they said, they're atheists, they're anti-theists, but if you gave them all the proof that God exists, they would decide to serve the devil. They said that explicitly in my debate with them. I'm on cordial terms with Amy, nothing personal, but that's a terrible thing. For a Christian to hear that, that's just a terrible thing. And then we have other individuals saying the same thing. They're atheists, but they would rather serve the devil if they knew that the Christian God were real. I view Karl Marx that kind of atheist, just this rage against this God he claims doesn't exist. You just see it all the time, this rage against a God that they claim they don't believe exists. So, I'm not going to try to uncoil that, but it's kind of a rage against reality. And so Karl Marx saying that, quoting his favorite line in all literature is, everything that exists deserves to perish. Just this kind of this rage against reality. So, so anyway, this was very insightful to me personally. And there's some things about Karl Marx's personal life that I might cover that are disturbing. One, he was just a total mooch, didn't work. His children were malnourished on top of everything else. He talked about capital. He never tried to acquire it for himself. He relied on the capital of other people most of his life. He was what I learned a new word, misanthrope. He hated people. Didn't get, he had a very nasty personality. He smelled bad on top of it. And he had really bad ideas. So he fought against Christianity. He felt that socialism would succeed if you while Christianity existed, because he said that's the opiate of the masses. And I'm not getting it exactly right, but very anti-Christian. But you see that what happens when you remove the moral foundation? If humans are the final, if the humans who have all the political and military power are the final authorities, are the final arbiters of what's right and wrong, it doesn't end well. We know that. And so this Marxism, why it fails, is it removes morality, and then it concentrates all the power in the state in the hands of a few. The very thing that he's trying to fight, he actually is promoting: concentration of power in people that have all the arbitrary, have no moral or ethical guidelines. So I showed that in the example of Mao. Saving face and retaining power was more important to him than actually implementing the communist state. And it's like, well, what do you expect? You set up a system where you say, well, let's seize all private property and now it belongs to the state. Well, who runs the state, so to speak? It's really the government that runs everything. And the power is concentrated in people that are have no moral foundation. Why should they care about this utopian vision at some point? We saw here earlier at his funeral, rather than praising the Christian God, they're praising Darwin. And at his wife's funeral, they did the same thing. So why is there any expectation that this is going to end well? It's an inherently incoherent idea. When you actually take all the factors, it is a recipe of disaster, and it's a recipe for disaster. And it's amazing he couldn't see it, or maybe that's what he wanted, just wanted to tear down all civilization. And it's done by promising utopia, not delivering it. So look at the great leap forward in Mao Zedong. He said, we're gonna have these farms. We're just gonna make so much. We're gonna have astronomical crop yields. Ended up creating a famine. Does that sound familiar? Of promise of utopia, and it ends up being the opposite, just this horrible thing. So in the last few weeks, I mean, I knew it was bad, but now it's starting to crystallize why it's bad and getting the history accurate. I kind of regret I was never taught this in school, because if I were, I would have better understood American values. What I've learned in just the last 2 weeks is more than I ever knew about why Marxism is so bad. They never taught me. And you know, it's really sad. I'll tell you, it's really sad. It's not taught in Christian Sunday schools, except recently. Thankfully, a local congregation here is starting to teach it in Sunday schools. We could not teach this at McLean Bible Church because it was, too political? And then also kind of against the sentiments of the left-leaning leadership. And yes, I'm in danger of being excommunicated because of what I'm saying from the church. But I've thought about this. I said, there are other churches that would welcome me. I'm only worried about being excommunicated, because then I'll have a harder time being there Sunday morning to reach out to people and tell them, hey, I run an Evidence Reasons Fellowship. We could not have this conversation in Sunday schools, because one, it would conflict with the narrative they're trying to convey last year with a Gramscian cultural Marxism that they deny they're doing, but they actually are from the pulpit. It would conflict. And I knew something was up when I was on Reddit blogs on Are Reformed, and I was saying, what's wrong with you guys? Why are you so left-leaning? And they were just glorifying Marxism. And so now, and I didn't appreciate this until Emery pointed it out, that and others, that Tim Keller, Presbyterian Church of America minister, very Marxist. And I didn't appreciate until like the last few weeks why this was so bad. I mean, I knew it was bad, but I didn't know the reason why. So now if someone talked to me, I think I can articulate it. And one of the reasons I'm pursuing it now is actually because as this channel has grown, like in the last 2 weeks, we've grown by about 40% in just 2 weeks, 40% because of the McLean thing. People in McLean Bible Church are saying, Sal, can you talk more about this, about Marxism? It's like, I don't know it any better than you do. But I said, well, I have an obligation now since they're asking that I cover these topics. By God's grace, I stumbled on Al Mohler's interview with Paul Kegnor. And it's really kind of disappointing now that given what Al Mohler knows about communism, that he's under his watch, he was letting a lot of it infiltrate. And it's in this interview, he talks about infiltration. He's letting it happen at SBC. It's like, dude, why? I don't get it. You see the truth more clearly than I ever did. What caused you to switch sides? That is the interesting question, because this interview here by Mohler of Kegnor, and let's see, when was it? February 10th of 2021, Al Mohler. You have this, and then under your watch, you've let all this left-leaning stuff come in under your own watch, and then you'll have an interview here where you espouse the glories of free markets and you decry Marxism. I don't get it, Al Mohler. But in any case, it was a great interview, and I'll try to put it in the video description. And sometimes it's hard to study the truth because it can be depressing for this world. So with that, let's study some truth from Scripture that will tell us how all of this will be eventually ended, from my favorite passage in Romans. So let me bring that up. He was a vocal leftist before the SBC went to the right. Then he changed his tune. He's a politician, nothing more. Wow. Okay. Oh, thank you, Patrick. And thank you for kind of rescuing this show by letting me know that the audio was bad. I had a chance to recover. So now let's turn to the scriptures. And let me shut off the camera here because things could be getting a little. The computer systems may be bogging down from too much load. But I had some discussions with some people at McLean Bible Church, and some of us have decided that fundamentally Christ's body is the individuals, not necessarily the local congregations. And we have decided that we're going to try to build these local ministries in our geographical area and then farther. Because of the internet, whatever I do on the internet, it can't have global reach, but we're going to have some events that are specifically tailored to the people in the local Northern Virginia, Maryland, Washington, D.C. area. So I'm going to be going around trying to meet people in the geographical area, finding out where their needs, and we'll make shows that are tailored to reaching out to them. And so tentatively this Friday, I'm going to launch something for the Evidence Reasons Fellowship of this greater Washington, D.C. area, but it'll be pretty much similar format to my other live streams. Uh, but I'm going to have kind of more um, for the local audience. I'll have to format the show a little bit, just slightly different. So I have to think about how I'm going to do that. So let me just share. Let me close with a passage from Scripture that I read often. And then I'll close the show with piano music. Here we go. What then shall we say to these things? If God is for us, who can be against us? He who did not spare his own son, but gave him up for us all, how will he not also with him graciously give us all things? Who shall God's elect? It is God who justifies. Who is to condemn? Christ Jesus is the one who died. More than that, who is raised. Who is at the right hand of God, who indeed is interceding for us? Who shall separate us from the love of Christ? Shall tribulation or distress or persecution or famine or nakedness or danger or sword? As it is written, for your sake we are being killed all the day long. We are regarded as sheep to be slaughtered. No, in all these things we are more than conquerors through him who loved us. For I am sure that neither death, nor life, nor angels, nor rulers, nor things present, nor things to come, nor powers, nor height, nor depth, nor anything else in all creation will be able to separate us from the love of God in Christ Jesus our Lord. Let me now load up the closing clip. Uh, it is Rachmaninoff's Rhapsody on a theme of Paganini. I'm delighted to have a chance to share it with you all. I've gotten some good remarks on it, and I'm glad to hear that because this is way back in my musician days. This is one of my favorite things to. So I'm going to share it to close. So with that, thank you for your fellowship, dear brothers and sisters, and enjoy the music. Take care, and the Lord richly bless you. Have a good night.